The lighting wasn't right. The heating didn't really work. People didn't know where the light switches were. The ventilation wasn't working properly because it was so open plan. The noise was so distracting for quite a lot of people. They hadn't checked people's working preferences. There were no quiet zones. There were no meeting rooms for staff. There's all these different things that are actively fighting against all the excellent work that they were trying to do in terms of looking after their staff, because they hadn't considered how the building affects it.
When it comes to our own physical and mental health, it's always a good idea to engage and talk to others about what we should be doing, who can help us, and what steps we need to take to achieve our overall goals. And they can be massively different depending on the type of person you are. Buildings don't have that luxury. Well, that was a step change I didn't see coming. They rely on us to build them and keep them upright, in shape, and keep them healthy. But these buildings and our surrounding environments have a huge impact on us, both mentally and physical, regardless of our age and ability. That's where the connection is. We hear a lot about how we build, maintain, and demolish our buildings, but not a lot about how these structures and the way they are built and maintained can help or hinder us. This is crazy when you think about the amount of time we spend in them, be it working, eating, sleeping, or relaxing. From the air quality, lighting, noise, moisture, heating, ventilation, and safety, there is much to be considered in the makeup of a healthy building. So let's chat to someone who knows about this kind of stuff. Becky Valentine is one of East Midlands' leading sustainability and building health consultants, supporting and advising businesses, schools, and charities in improving their sustainability, well-being, and performance. Becky is the co-owner of Spenbeck, with over 10 years' experience in sustainability and building health, helping a range of clients embed sustainability and climate change mitigation across their operations, with particular expertise on governance, culture, policy to optimize engagement, and achieve ESG targets. Complemented by her former teaching career and current role as Associate Lecturer in Sustainability at Nottingham Trent University, Becky's expertise is repeatedly sought after for high-profile expert panels, keynote speeches, featured articles, podcasts, yes, and going back to those featured articles, she's worked with people like UN Global Compact UK Network and UK Construction Week. Becky, did I miss anything off that intro? And welcome.
Welcome, thank you, and no, you didn't.
Fantastic. Delighted for you to be here. This will be really cool chatting to you. So let's get stuck in. And there's a little bit of a long preamble to this, but we'll get there in the end. So let's kick off with, so many people are returning to the office over the last 18 to 24 months, or at least that's the kind of prerequisite for working now, more of a hybrid model. And because of that, I don't think there's ever been such a focus on health and well-being within the workspace. And one element that plays a big part of that is obviously the building itself. Sustainability, health, and well-being agendas have led to the emergence of a more holistic, human-centered approach to design and made health and well-being increasingly influential in not only returning to a workspace, but choosing an employer or career path itself. That influential. From the types of materials for the fixtures and fittings to the building's performance in air quality, acoustics, and natural lighting, for example, all impact on our relationships with our own built environment, which can be lengthened to our own spaces at home. Work and home, I would say, are the main buildings we reside in. So, with this in mind, I'd first like to dig a little deeper into the importance of this type of building health.
I think it's fundamental to our safety and security at work and at home. We tend not to think about the building in which we're in. We walk in, we work, or we live, or we shop, and we leave. Bear in mind, we spend 90% of our time indoors. I just don't think there's enough conversation and awareness about the vital role the building itself and how the building performs plays in how we operate inside, be it from our mental and physical well-being, from our almost our motivation to work, our motivation to be there. And I think it's a bizarre one because the field of building health really came out of sick building syndrome in the 80s. So, sort of 40 odd years later, it's huge in academic circles. The research has been there for 40 years. It doesn't translate widely, which is a real surprise. But I think what shifted the dial with so many things was COVID, and actually having an awareness of what happens in the buildings, particularly around ventilation. As you mentioned, a range of building health foundations there, but we just I feel we've started to be slightly more aware of what the building itself is doing to us and the environment within the building, which can only be a positive thing.
Yeah. What did you mention there about the 80s? Building sickness or something?
Yes, the sick building syndrome.
What's that?
Yeah, well, that is how the building makes you unwell. So things like damp, we know damp, mold, inflames asthma, those with other breathing difficulties. We know that we've always known that how the building performs impacts people, but it's never translated into the mainstream. It's all out there in plain sight. And I'm just passionate about, on a corporate level, there's the WELL program, Fit Well, BRIAM in terms of sort of the construction side, which involves building health, but that feels very corporate. It's quite when it's done through those programs, it is quite expensive. It's worth it, obviously, I say that, but it is quite expensive. What I'm passionate about is taking the principles of building health and applying it to everybody, particularly when you are responsible, as you said, for people who work from home, and now people are hybriding more in a lot of sectors. It's important for people to understand how working from home is impacting us just as much as it is when we go into the office.
See, I didn't realize it was as high as 90% indoors, but I suppose that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Because if you consider sleeping and like you said, shopping or fitness and work and social, the majority is indoors, isn't it? It never crossed my mind that it'd be as high as that.
I know, and getting to the fundamentals of building health, that completely disconnects who we are as animals in the natural world to what we put ourselves in. We think we're intelligent as humans. Our bodies are physiologically, neurologically programmed to still be in caves and spend most of our time outside. Yet we spend 90% of our time indoors. And we haven't appreciated how that lifestyle within the building, let alone the building itself, is impacting us. And it's that disconnect that causes a lot of the mental and physical issues. And what building health tries to do as a concept is reconnect us with our natural state. I mean, in its fundamental form, it's that simple.
And I suppose humans being lazy and hate, not hating, but we can be as a species reluctant to change. If somebody says you can work from home 100%, 90%, 80%, 50%, whatever it is of the time, then I suppose the first thought, if you're that way inclined, is, oh, fantastic, I get to stay at home a lot, without thinking of, I know myself, I can be in, because I work from home majority of the time, I can be in a room, or at least in the house. It could be nearly 100% of those 24 hours, less than 90%. I might walk somewhere, but it's certainly not enough time to be outside. And the impact that, if this building wasn't fantastic, could have on me is massive. And we might not consider that because we're focusing on the work part of things.
Well, absolutely. And it's about how that room performs to help you. So it is in terms of what your air quality is like, what your furnishings, your fixtures and fittings, how many chemicals are leaching out of those into your air, how well ventilated your room is, how much natural light is coming in. We start to look at those because all of those impact us. We are, again, if we bring it back to the fact that we are animals, essentially, we're natural beings that are programmed to respond to the natural environment. If you take us away from that, that is going to have a huge impact on on how our brain functions, how our body functions. So it's making rooms, we mitigate the impact of the rooms that we're just not designed to be in. And particularly because the pace of change has been so rapid, we can't evolve at that speed. So there's just no way we are able to catch up with what changes we're having in terms of the blue light from screens and the fact that we live sedentary lives for those of us who work in office sectors. There's an awful lot of people out there, particularly construction, who are on their feet and they're out and about, and that's fantastic. And it's almost about celebrating that and not trying to get people just sat in a room, because actually that's fundamentally going to undermine our well-being. So yeah, we need to think about all of these things. And the thing that I love most about the concept of building health is when you talk about it to the uninitiated, it's a bit like, no, I haven't heard of that. Of course not. It's not a problem. Then when you discuss it, everyone's like, but that's common sense. It's like, yes, it is. But we don't do it. We don't think about it in a strategic way. And it's really straightforward as a concept. And once you apply it, you're like, oh, okay. And a lot of people will go, do you know, I feel better when I've had a walk, but they don't understand why. I feel better when I work next to the window with the natural light, but they don't understand why. Piecing those bits together to help people, empower them to make the right decisions with sort of space planning or how they work from home, where they work from home. It's just, making them understand how their physiology and the neurology works to then make sure that we're mitigating the fact that we are inside for 90% of the time.
Yeah, cogs are going now in my brain in terms of the way we actually build buildings and who they're actually for, and whether they look nice architecturally and they're very different and standoutish, or whether they're actually made for us to work at our maximum capacity. And I don't mean work from looking at a screen. Whatever you do in life, to get as close to 100% out of you as possible. Which is really interesting. You start to see buildings very differently, which is cool. So I can
built for the vanity of the architect. How many are built because that's the space that you've got to squeeze something in? I mean, increasingly with things like the WELL standard and Fitwel in America, and say BREEAM, new builds are starting to be built in this way. It is, as I said earlier, it's quite expensive at the moment, but these relatively early initiatives always are. That the hope is that in 5-10 years time, this is the norm. I remember listening to a fabulous lady speak about sustainability. And she's a leading sustainability consultant down in London. And someone asked her, what she hopes to see in 5 years time. She said, I want to be out of a job because people are doing it anyway. Kind of how I feel about building health. At some point, I don't want to be avoiding that because it's just standard. But at the same time, it feels the preserve of new builds. And actually, you can retrofit. You can easily adapt your space currently using building health principles. So that's the joy of it. It doesn't have to be expensive. It doesn't have to be onerous. There's so many quick wins you can have with it. And I think that's what's exciting about it, is when people come over to the light side and go, oh, okay, I get it now. It literally the light side. And it's great. And it makes, what I also like about it is the research helps prove the business case. So it's not talking from possibly a more mercenary standpoint for, the business leaders among us. The evidence for how it improves performance is there. So it's not about, I'm spending all this money and I'm just focusing on health and well-being, ticking a box, if that's how you feel. But actually, we all know anyway that if people are feeling better mentally and physically, they will just perform better as humans, and therefore that will translate to performance. But the statistics are there to back up how the sort of improvements you can get by putting building health in. I mean, there's productivity if the room is too hot or too cold. And yes, there are personal differences in there, but within a range, you can lose productivity 15%. Just by tweaking the radiator 1 or 2 degrees can have a huge impact, not just on your energy efficiency, so your sustainability, the cost of that, and the performance of your staff. It's the same with air quality and reducing chemicals. It's about, natural light. If you don't have enough natural light, your probability of developing depression goes up by 70%. So when we're thinking about absenteeism and the impact of that on your turnover, of how your business operates, all of a sudden it becomes a really important fundamental delivery of how you're operating your building to reduce that probability, to make sure that you get the best out of your staff. And you also have a moral obligation. It's different argument to the business case. Pure financial,
Yeah.
they all stack up.
But that's how I see almost. It's never as simple as that, but good business, bad business from an employee perspective. It's that it's not seen as, I've worked in construction the majority of my career, and I've been in multiple businesses, and some of them it's you could get in early and but if you go early, it's like, oh, you're finishing early, you're not busy, or you work late, it's, oh, he's working hard and stuff like that. Yeah, they don't take that time to highlight or allow you to work at your best, in the best conditions. It's all about, here's a screen, I want you to work all these hours, and it's a bit clock watchy, whereas if you step away from that and say, okay, how can we get the best out of this person? Right, well, they need this to operate, they need that to operate, or whatever it is. Like you said, you can get a lot more out of them than in I'm not going to say mill type operation, but if you're looking at the clock and saying, "Oh no, you're finishing at 4, not 5." Ooh, it's a bit. You better.
I think that's one of the bonuses that we had of COVID, if I'm allowed to say that, from making us understand how people work. Because one of the fundamentals of building health is about personalization. Because your sort of thermal comfort levels will be different to mine. Age, sex, it all impacts on that, in terms of lighting preferences. We're all different. And what we can't do is provide buildings that tick what every single person needs. But by zoning, by actually understanding what your staff need, then you can start to meet them. And even just attempting to meet them makes you a better employer. Your staff will respond as a whole more positively to that. And because they respond positively, they'll be more motivated, and then hopefully that will, result in better performance. It's just about maximizing what that human can do for themselves. And if you're a good employer, that will naturally translate into wanting to do well for you at work. The more mercenary, only a bottom line focus will go, great, that will help me get more turnover because they'll work better. Well, yeah, it will. But over and above that, from an ESG perspective, it's that holistic sort of sustainable approach of the human being. If their health and well-being mentally and physically is optimized, then they're just going to enjoy life more. They're going to be happier at work. They're going to perform better for you at work, but also for themselves with their friends, just how they are. And it's such an easy thing to do relatively, but it never gets considered. I work with a company, absolutely amazing. They hugely committed to health and well-being. They spent a fortune and a long period of time putting together a really good health and well-being program for their staff. They got their staff engaged. It was so genuine. It was brilliant. Their office was fighting against absolutely every single thing they were trying to achieve. That the lighting wasn't right, the heating didn't really work, people didn't know where the light switches were, the ventilation wasn't working properly, there was so much, because it was so open plan, the noise was so distracting for quite a lot of people. They hadn't checked people's working preferences. There were no quiet zones, there were no meeting rooms or meeting areas for staff. They had to only use client meeting rooms if they were available, and they kind of never were. There's all these different things that are actively fighting against all the excellent work that they were trying to do in terms of looking after their staff, because they hadn't considered how the building affects it. And we've now changed quite a few things in it, and it's so much better. And that's what breaks my heart, when you've got companies so committed who then just need that final piece of the jigsaw, which is the building itself. to really help.
Speaking of that, we've touched upon a few of the standards or accreditations, and there seems to be a fair few. One article cited that the LED or LEED certified buildings produce around about 34% lower CO2 emissions, consume 25% less energy, and 11% less water. And there are others that you've mentioned, like BREEAM and WELL, the Living Building Challenge, DGNB, Active House, things like that. So we've spoken about kind of the obvious and how it can help and impact businesses. But what's your process for changing a physical working environment and the building itself?
So looking at existing buildings. I follow the foundations of a healthy building from Harvard. So this isn't a certifiable standard like WELL, Fitwell, but I really like it because it's a nice, straightforward process for the smaller companies that I work with to be able to access. So the first thing you do is look at where they are and do an audit of what's happening right now, because actually not all spaces are bad. So it's always important to highlight what they're doing well already, whether they did it consciously or not. Let's start with what's working and explain that. And then it's about going around and doing an audit of the space, looking at all the different foundations. So water quality, air quality, natural light, noise levels, dust and cleaning. I also look at biophilia and active design on top of that, because they're really key parts of building health. So go around and do an audit, and then also ideally do preference surveys as well, and employee perception surveys. Find out how they feel about the building, find out about what their own personal preferences are. And then you can start to put it together about what's missing, what's already there, what little tweaks can we do in terms of quick wins, no cost, all the way up to capital spend. We do air quality monitoring. So we're looking at CO2 levels, PM particle matter levels to have a look at that. We had one where they just had their HVAC system cleaned out, but actually one of them wasn't performing well, and we could tell that from the air monitoring. So that was really helpful to be able to go back, because otherwise you wouldn't know. And the PM levels were sort of off the chart, and we're like, okay, this is not good. So that's really helpful, because otherwise, and nothing against the contractor, they think they've done what they needed to do, and so having this little monitoring is just really helpful to just make sure everything is working as it should, and that's great. And then the idea is to match the worker preferences with any sort of space planning changes that you need. Things like quite a lot of offices in particular will have, the wide downlighting, even though it might be LED, which is brilliant from an energy efficiency perspective. I personally, I don't know about you, lots of people listening to this really benefit from more directed light. So it's like, actually, if you give people desk lamps, if you can, then maybe you don't have to have all the overheads on, because later on at night, particularly now, sort of mid-afternoon, it's starting to get a bit dusky. I'm actually happy with the main overlights off and a more targeted light. So let's do that. It's cheaper, and it means that I'm going to be more productive because I'm working better because I've got that. It's about then starting to see, okay, well, we do have a range of preferences in terms of we need to create a quiet space for people to concentrate. We need like a lovely social hub where people can go and be creative and brainstorm and do all that stuff together. And it quite often is just tweaking what people have already got. I know an awful lot of businesses who you walk in the room and you're like, okay, so none of your desks are near the windows. So we've got all this artificial light, which is playing havoc. It might be LED, brilliant from a sustainability perspective, but if we could move people nearer the window, that would be great. So again, that's probably not costing much, really. Just a quick layout of the desk. So it's really marrying how the building's performing right now with what people need, and seeing how we can most cost effectively put it all together. I mean, one of my big things is about active design, because actually quite a lot of buildings and offices are spread out or laid out so that people don't move, and we need people to move, and we need to be explaining why people need to move. This is a fabulous book I always reference called Primate Change, And possibly the most terrifying statistic in that book was that people in their mid-40s who sit for about 6 to 7 hours a day on average will reduce their life expectancy by about 6 to 8 years.
Wow.
It's like, right. Okay. So from a building health perspective, what are you doing? Because again, humans generally inherently lazy, I find. So, you know, how can we create that mindset change? How many meetings can you have where you go for a walk instead, if the weather's nice, not when it's pouring with rain, but actually, can we do that? I know people have standing desks, and that's great. Maybe give people the option if they want to do that, even for one meeting. It's, you know, whereabouts are things that you can encourage people not to take the lift and take the stairs? You know, there's a lot of behavioral change required when you come to certain aspects of building health as well. But the process is lovely and straightforward, and hopefully a really positive one, because you're just always bringing people back to where they should be as a natural state, and it shouldn't be expensive.
Yeah, I love that, and we've both mentioned it, the humans are lazy kind of thing, and if you give them a desk to sit at for 7-8 hours a day, they probably will, because that's the easiest thing, least path of resistance, that's your go-to. Traditionally, that's how we've seen an office or an office space. But you know, I've got a stand-up desk, and I love nothing more than utilizing it as much as possible. You know, as much as my body will let me. But yeah, I just love the fact that it's simple changes. You know, simple changes, but it's almost like you never know until you know, and I think that's what you bring very well, is that the fact you're highlighting these things.
Yeah, and it's about, I mean, obviously, I'm a sustainability and building health consultant because the two are beautifully symbiotic. You know, it's taking that natural passive approach as much as possible. We're not saying if your ventilation's poor, you can't put in mechanical ventilation. But actually, building health is coming from the point of how do we use what's naturally around us as the main starting point and as much as possible. So how can we maximize cross ventilation? Because that's the cheapest, best ventilation you're going to get. If you're fortunate enough, you might not feel it, but to work in a Georgian building that has sash windows, do you know how to use your sash windows properly to maximize the ventilation? Most of the time, sash windows, we just open the bottom, but they're designed to open top and bottom so that the air circulates better. That's going to help with your thermal comfort. That's going to be far cheaper. You don't need necessarily to be spending a huge amount of money on mechanical systems. They have their place, absolutely. There's a lot of offices that probably can't use cross ventilation, but there's probably a lot that have not even thought about it. So it's sort of like if you're space planning and you're retrofitting an office, you're having an office fit out, where are you putting your partitions so that you don't block cross ventilation opportunities? You know, you start to think about those as they go in as well. So it's really simple, and it can be as expensive as you want to make it, but I am a firm believer that it shouldn't be expensive at all.
Okay, excellent. So I'm going to get a bit more complex here. I'm going to add a few things into the mix to test your knowledge, skills, and abilities. But according to the Centre of Aging Better, 21% of homes in the UK were built in 1919, 38% before 1946, and only 7% after the year 2000. I think those percentages might fluctuate depending on your resources. Commercial buildings also have a lifespan of about 65 to 100 years. So those that were built a while ago still exist and are up and running. If this shows us anything, it's the fact that we have a very diverse building stock in the UK. And this can pose many problems, but one of the first problems, because of the diversity, it means any type of retrofitting is more bespoke rather than mass-produced. So how does the building age, the style, the type, impact building health and remodeling the different spaces that we need that will help us?
I think you used the word bespoke. It's that. It's that simple. Everything should be bespoke. I think it's taking into account context and nuance that I think sometimes, particularly in construction, because my other hat is I'm a landlord of 40,000 square foot of grade 2 listed 1854 building, you know, and if we can't carbon copy it and do it quickly and mass produce it, we don't like it anymore. But actually, we can learn so much from different buildings of different ages and how they perform. I've just referenced the Georgian sash windows. You know, there's so much brilliant passive design in older buildings. And I think, you know, I'm not an architect, but I do not appreciate the sort of shorter, squatter buildings and office spaces, particularly of the 80s, the 70s, 80s, 90s, where it feels like so squashed in and low ceilings and Artex walls and just a disaster from a building health perspective, basically. Whereas you look at really modern day buildings that are coming through now, they are coming through with building health principles built in, natural light. How do we maximize thermal comfort? Although some, I think, are too glazed and rely on mechanical, but still it's there in principle. I think older buildings, I mean, our building's over 150 years old. So I balk at this comment that a sustainable building is one that lasts 60 years. That's a whole different conversation and frankly ridiculous. Why are we only aiming for that? Different podcast. I should get off my soapbox because
no.
Our building is, as a Victorian built building, is triple brick construction. It's got mostly metal frames, single glazed, and we had to replace quite a lot. We've just refurbished the facade of it to make sure that it works from a fabric perspective to then do the decarbonisation measures internally. And the listed single pane glazing that's original performs better than the modern equivalent that we had to try and match it with. No because way. They just did things better and perform better. And because we are using the burnt mastic to seal the windows, it allows the building to still, I know we're not really supposed to use breathe, but breathe, there's that natural permeability that allows the natural ventilation in the building. So you don't get the buildup of mold and moisture and condensation that you do in more modern buildings, not necessarily the ones we're building right now, but again, those 80s, 90s buildings. So I think it's a bit of a fallacy to look at older buildings particularly and go, oh, you know, they're quite problematic. Actually, they teach us so much about building health, because whether it was a deliberate view for the health of whoever was in it, or it was trying to maximize what they could get out of the occupants, the way an awful lot of older buildings were built were along building health principles. You've got high ceilings, so you've got better movement of air. You've got the ability for cross ventilation. You've got natural light streaming through. They were using natural products. You know, we use so many synthetic products right now. And we have done sort of for the last 40 odd years. They are poisoning the air that we breathe. The VOCs, the volatile organic compounds, in so many products, carpet tiles, paint, you know, the furnishings you have that you bring in because of the fire retardants, they're all off-gassing and they're all putting those and they go in the air that you breathe. And that triggers asthma, bronchitis. It's certain VOCs are linked to certain cancers. You know, so actually we go back to your point about everything needing to be bespoke. That's as it should be. But actually building health needs in older buildings are far less than they are in newer buildings, because they were inherently constructed far more healthily than we have over the last 40, 50 years. And I am slightly biased because I've been brought up with this gorgeous building that we have. But that's my love and understanding of building health was that actually if you build the building correctly at the start with these principles either in mind or subconsciously, then you're onto a winner kind of before you started. But it doesn't preclude retrofitting what you've got. But, you know, I don't see any issue with the type of building. I think it just demonstrates how much more you have to adapt and mitigate. So I think older buildings have less effort. The ones, sort of the last 30, 40 years, I think are the ones that need a bit more help to, you know, maybe take out the false ceilings and take it all back to the brickwork. If the brickwork's sound enough to let it breathe, because it should breathe. You know, we went through a phase of hermetically sealing people in boxes and wondering why they're ill. It's like, well, because you're not ventilating the rooms. And then you have this issue of outside air being outside air, not fresh air. So again, it's not just always what the building is in terms of age, but where it's located. So there's all these different factors, but I think Age is not a barrier for buildings as well as humans. That's how I feel about it.
And it sounds like you can learn a lot from the older type of buildings in terms of like just the windows that you mentioned earlier. You know, it didn't even occur to me that if you open the top and the bottom, it's better ventilation. You know, it's just things like that that we can learn quite a lot from older buildings that can help us build into the future.
I think so. I mean, again, hands up, I'm completely biased. I do think there's a not snobbery, that's the wrong word, but there's almost a feeling that, because it's old, they didn't really have the technology then and they didn't know. But actually, if you look at, I'm not an architect, but if you look at more the passive house measures, we're coming back to the principles that the Victorians and the Georgians had when they built their buildings. Now, not every Victorian and Georgian building is fabulous and needs to be, used as an exemplar. Some of them weren't great at all. But generally speaking, the principles they used are the ones we're shouting about now, going, wow, look at us, aren't we great? It's like, we're just reinventing the wheel. There's nothing really new here in terms of the principles. How we deliver it might be quicker. There'll be fewer deaths and injuries of building things and things like that. But actually, it's nothing new, really. I think we're always quite quick to self-congratulate, but the fundamentals of building health and having your building constructed to look after who's in it has been around for hundreds of years.
Oh, I was just about to say, yeah, it's that new shiny thing, isn't it? It's always newer is seen as better, and it goes through cycles. But I think we've seen with upcycling or recycling and charity shops and things like that secondhand isn't a bad thing. And I suppose that it links to the building. It's like not all new buildings technically are as good as the old buildings. The old building could just need a bit of TLC and it works more efficiently than this new building.
So the Architects Journal did their campaign about the greenest building is one that already exists. And I very much piggyback building health onto that to a degree because, for all the reasons we've just said, actually we learn an awful lot from older buildings. We learn what not to do as well. I'm not saying they are absolutely brilliant and we should follow absolutely everything because no, they're not. But again, tying building health in with sustainability, just things like when we think about fixtures and fittings and furnishings, because that's a big part of the air quality side of building health. They used to have wing-back chairs, not because they look fabulous, but to stop the draft. Nowadays we put the heating up and then complain we're paying so much. Actually, if we think back in the olden days, they dressed appropriately for the weather and their furnishings understood that. So you would have high wing-back chairs by the fire because that stopped the draft. It kept the heat in to where it needed it, and it was more localized. And that's what we're doing with building health as principles now. It's, do you need massive amount of heating on? Your heating needs will be totally different to mine, particularly when, I'm a little bit older and I've got my own personal radiator walking around with me all the time. I don't, I might be there going, can you turn the aircon up, down? Everyone's different. So why not plan? I know when one of the biggest complaints for people is lack of thermal comfort in a workplace because we've all got our own, and it's finding that Goldilocks zone individually, of it not being too hot, too cold, but it's just right for you. And you're never going to manage that 100%. But why not try to make it better? So if you're really hot, you can go and sit by the open window because we've got natural ventilation coming in. If you're a bit colder, why not supply people with hot water bottles? Does it really matter that you're doing that now? Why do we need the heating on for everybody? You boys are always in shorts, whatever the weather. It's crazy. But, let's work with those individual preferences for what people need. It's cheaper, it's more sustainable, and it'll make people perform better. And those principles stem right back from how we used to be using our buildings, 100 years, 200 years ago. I'm on my soapbox now.
No, that's brilliant. So let's finish up with looking at technology. So, we've spoken about older buildings and new buildings and how we build them and how we have built them and look into the future. But in your line of work, what is there any technology that's changed the way you work, or helping you, or facilitating the way you work better?
Sort of the only really tech I need are the air quality monitoring. They're vital because that's the bits we can't see.
Yeah.
And you know, the nitrous oxide, carbon dioxide, the PM matters, 2.5 and 10, to just demonstrate that invisibility of what we're breathing in. That really helps. Other than that, it's really low key. I mean, the technology can support measures, you know, the more capital intensive measures that we might want to bring in, but actually, that again, that's the joy of building health. Is it doesn't need to be difficult, but you couldn't do it properly without that monitoring equipment. That's vital. But nothing else. Again, in terms of recommending measures, you've got your tech in terms of lighting. App controlled heating lighting is vital now. If you want to go that high end, the different types of lighting, it doesn't trigger neurodiverse concerns, for instance, is brilliant in terms of personalizing and providing that bespoke environment. And again, that is up to budgets and how far people want to go. The technology is very much there to support people on that. But in terms of the delivery of it, air monitors, air quality monitors is for me. I don't want to be bamboozling people. I don't want to be making it needs to be accessible. I would like people to evangelize about this so that, you know, in 10 years time, I don't have that job. That's what that's the aim. And I think sometimes the reliance on tech makes it a bit prohibitive.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's seen right across construction in a way, but partly why I do this podcast. But another reason I do it is to talk to people that are hugely passionate and excited about what they do in the industry, regardless of what that may be. And Becky, you're certainly one of those people. You know, you can tell you keep saying you've said soapbox 3 or 4 times, but it's not soapbox. I just see it as passion coming out, and you want people to know this stuff because it's important, and you've got a huge passion for that, which is commendable and absolutely fantastic to speak to anybody with that passion. So I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for coming on. I've learned a hell of a lot in terms of building health, even though, as you said, isn't that obvious? Yeah, it kind of feels obvious, but it isn't until someone like you points out. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing your knowledge.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for the invite.